Coming up on this week's episode of TechSNAP, we'll bust the FUD around the media's overreaction to some simple SSH key mismanagement, plus the popular WordPress plugin that could be exposing millions of databases, a rockin' roundup, and a big batch of your questions. All that and a heck of a lot more on this week's episode of TechSNAP. Hi everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP. This is episode 90 of Jupiter Broadcasting's weekly systems network and administration podcast. This episode was streamed live on December 27th, 2012, and this episode's brought to you by GoDaddy.com. I'll tell you more about them as the show goes on. And the live stream is powered by ScaleEngine.com, which is awesome. My name is Chris, and joining us every single week is our host, the admin, the tech, and the teacher, Alan Jude. Hey there, Alan.
Hey, Chris, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Dude, episode 90. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Already.
90 in a row, too, without a single break, which is also quite impressive,
90
I must say.
episodes in a row.
And you know what? Big show today. Not big in terms of show doc, but big in terms of topics that we're going to be covering. I'm looking forward to it. I thought it was risky doing a show this week because the news cycle just kind of comes to an end.
There was enough stuff left over from last week. I could have made a show just out of that.
Yeah.
But I ended up not using any of that stuff because of new stuff.
Yeah, there's some big stuff that happened this week, so we're going to chat about that. So why don't we launch with our first story, and one that I actually pinged you about in the chat room earlier this morning because I was kind of worried because it could apply to us.
Yes, because I double-checked as soon as I read the story before you were even awake.
Good man, Alan. Good man. All right, so tell me what's going on here.
Okay, so W3 Total Cache, which is a very, very popular WordPress plugin, may expose sensitive data to anyone on the internet.
This article we're reading is from the securityledger.com.
Right, although it was originally posted on the open or disclosure, full disclosure mailing list.
Sure.
So W3 Total Cache is very popular. It's got like 1.4 million downloads or something like that.
Yeah.
It's, it's actually what ScaleEngine recommends you install on your WordPress blog to integrate it with ScaleEngine. And it's also a very powerful caching plugin on top of its CDN features. So basically, a researcher discovered a problem that's technically a configuration error, not a vulnerability, but because it's the default configuration, most sites that have this installed will actually be vulnerable. And it's kind of a big deal, so... one of the other things I got a lot of questions about is what it actually does, the plugin. Like, why would I want to install this?
Yeah,
so I've kind of broken down some of the features and what they do.
And why, because Jupiter Broadcasting uses it. And
yes, extensively, and it makes a huge difference on your site's loading speed.
Yeah.
So the first thing that it does is a page cache. So basically, when an anonymous viewer goes to your site and loads it, normally in a web application like WordPress, basically it has to make a bunch of database queries, read the template files, do all this, and it generates a page and sends it to the browser. Doing that every time someone loads the page can mean a lot of CPU time, a lot of database queries, and so on.
It's silly, really, if you think about it.
Especially when everybody's going to see the same page, right?
Yeah.
The front page is the same for everyone unless you're logged in.
Changes like once a day.
Yeah. So what the page cache plugin does is once it's generated that page for someone, it saves it as an actual .html file in a directory. And then when a second user tries to load the page, we just send them that HTML file instead of doing all the dynamic processing again.
I love this.
Yeah. And you can set a time, say only do the, only keep it for 5 minutes and then compile it again. Or, you can say keep it until I post a new article or whatever. Or, some pages like the specific show notes for, say, TechSNAP episode 84, that gets cached and that never changes until it's you edit the page in WordPress.
Right. And then does WordPress communicate with the plugin to tell it when to purge the cache, or how does that? Okay.
Yes, the plugin knows when a page gets edited and can either purge the cache or prime it by actually running the page, generating the output, and saving it again. So that the very first user to view it doesn't have to wait while it does all the work.
Right.
It also has a database cache. Basically, by caching the results of the read database query, where look up this information in a table, and saving that, next time it needs to do that query, instead of having to connect to MySQL and do the query, it can just say, hey, I've already looked that up in the last couple of minutes. Why don't I just use the results I already have?
Right.
And then usually you have a expiration on that that's fairly short, so that even if the data does change, the cache will expire after, say, 5 minutes, and you'll just look it up again. But, if there's a lot of people looking at the page, even just only having to look it up once every 5 minutes instead of, 100 times a second will make a big savings.
And this plugin's grown so much, they actually have a commercial offering built around it now.
Yep,
and
with support and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. So what's the vulnerability? Or, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt,
almost there.
Okay.
So the object cache is a higher level than the database. Instead of caching just the results of a database query, it caches an entire object, like a programming object, where maybe that's constructed from a bunch of separate database queries, all happening at once or something. And, a bunch of different queries feeding in to make this object. So if you cache the whole object, you don't have to do a bunch of queries. Right? Or even load a bunch of queries out of the cache. And then it also has, it can do minification, which is removing comments and white space from your HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and so on.
And that's just to tighten it up? Just to make it less to transfer?
That makes it smaller, and then you gzip it to make it even smaller. Now, doing that dynamically every time, it saves the user download speed, but it takes longer and it uses CPU time on the server. So you cache the minified version of the files, and then you have to cache a new version if you change one of the CSS files or something. It can also do combining. So normally, you have a template and it keeps a bunch of separate CSS files to make it easier to edit. Or, you have a template and then this plugin adds a CSS file and this plugin adds 3 more CSS files and the WordPress has its base CSS files and then you have jQuery UI and it has this CSS file. Right. You end up loading literally like 30 separate CSS files.
Yeah.
Well, this plugin will actually take all 30 of them, combine them into one file that's based on the hash of the content of all of them. So if any one of them ever changes, it'll generate a new file. But that means that the end user has to download one CSS file instead of 40.
Right.
So on top of saving space and the overhead of the HTTP headers every time, you're also just saving the latency of asking the server for each individual file all the time. For JavaScript, you can do the same thing, but it can split it into separate files depending on when you need that JavaScript file. Right? Some scripts have to go in the head section before the page even starts to load. Some have to go at the top of the page, and some you want to wait until the very bottom of the page. Once everything else is done, then run this JavaScript. So it allows you to say, this script goes here, this script, and then combine those so you're only downloading 3 files instead of another 30. And you're gzipping those to make them smaller.
Right.
And then the feature that we were after at Scale Engine is CDN offloading.
Yes.
Which we use at Jupiter Broadcasting. And basically what it says is we're going to change the URL to, say, the CSS file or the JavaScript file or this image or thumbnail or whatever, so that instead of loading the image from your website, it loads it from a Scale Engine cache, which got it from your website earlier and is now serving it without having to use the bandwidth of your server. At Scale, in your example where you're also hosted at Scale Engine, it's not as big a deal. It still saves you money, but if you had your own server still, offloading those images would save you a lot of bandwidth and a lot of requests per second.
Yeah.
The other thing it does is it can split up the content so that CSS files load off this subdomain, JavaScript off this subdomain, and images off these 3 separate subdomains. That way, your browser will only connect to each site, I think the default is 3 times, right? To avoid overburdening the server by asking it for 5 files at once, it'll only ask for 3 at a time. Well, if you
from
use
the same domain.
Right. So if you use a bunch of separate subdomains, it thinks each of those is a separate server. So now it'll request like 12 files at once.
So it's like instead. Parallel processing for loading your files in a way. It's
yes.
Like
so, when you load the Jupiter Broadcasting homepage, instead of loading the thumbnails 1 at a time or 2 at a time, it starts loading them all at once. Because most people have broadband internet that's able to do that, but it comes down to the latency of asking each, waiting once you get the file, asking for the next one and then the next one, right? Instead, just say, give me all of them. And then they all come in at once.
Right.
So by breaking that up, we can load like 6 or 8 of them at once or 12 instead of 2 or 3. And it makes the site load a lot faster.
It's like having multiple hard drives almost in your computer. Like that's why when video editing, I have 3 or 4 drives that I'm working from. So that way I can read from one and write to the other one. And it increases my overall throughput, just like loading images from multiple servers does.
Yeah. And well, the other thing is because we're using the CDN, users will actually usually end up pulling from multiple servers in addition to the fact that they're doing multiple connections that way. But anyway, the problem stems from the fact that all of these caches in W3 Total Cache have a number of options. They have basic disk caching, which just writes files out to the disk. Advanced caching on disk, which is more structured, like it's designed for bigger sites where you're going to end up with a lot of files and you want to split them up into subdirectories or whatever. An opcode cache, like something like APC or Xcache or whatever. And then a dedicated cache, something like Memcache. The problem comes specifically with the disk caching. Because that's the default that W3 Total Cache uses because it doesn't require any additional configuration.
It's just easy. You turn it on.
Right, yeah. And also, if you're using shared hosting somewhere or whatever, it doesn't rely on them having APC installed or, if you're going to use Memcache, you need to know the IP address of the Memcache server and you have to have set one up.
You have to have one.
So you have to have one and you have to enter a bunch of information about it.
Yeah.
So having that as the default doesn't make sense because it requires a bunch of information that you'd have to collect. So the default is to do disk caching, which is fine for like the minification cache and the page cache and so on. The problem comes from where W3 Total Cache stores that cache. For the database and object caches, it's storing them under wp-content/w3tc/db cache. The main problem there is that directory is publicly accessible, right? So someone can go just type in the URL of that directory on your site, and depending on your server configuration, would get a listing of all the files in that directory, unless you have directory listings disabled. So if you have directory listings enabled, then now they can see every item in your database cache. And just by clicking on each one, they can see what's in your cache.
Oh.
But even if you have that disabled, the file names for the database cache are just MD5s of a string like W3TC underscore the name of your website underscore the site ID number from WordPress underscore SQL underscore and then the SQL query that you're executing. So based on this, the guy who discovered this wrote a little shell script that just iterates through a bunch of site IDs and the first 25 users and checks for any database query that looks up those users, right? Because in almost every configuration, at least one of the first 25 users in your database is going to have administrative privileges. So by basically using brute force, just guessing the file names because they're just the MD5 hash of a string that we know, they can try to access the result of a database query, such as select star from WordPress users where user ID equals 1, which would give them the hash of your password. Now, WordPress is using PHP Pass, which is kind of salted, but not cryptographically. So basically, there's a little video on his site there where it just shows him a bunch of random guesses until he finds the file name that has the hash of the administrative user, and then feed that into John the Ripper, brute force it for a little while, and then there's the password. You now have administrator access to this WordPress.
Ah. Wow, that's no good.
Yes. So that directory should be outside the web root somewhere where it's not accessible via the internet ever, or not via HTTP anyway. Or there should be some system set up to deny access to that file, right? Like a .htaccess file that says no one's allowed to read this directory.
Could this all just be solved by .htaccess files?
Yes, although a better way would be to have these directories be outside of the web root. But because it's a WordPress plugin and it's working that way, they are where they are. So
and that's usually where most of the users the user account running the WordPress installation has rights to access.
Exactly.
Right.
So yes, it's it can be solved with just a .htaccess file or a server config directive for Apache or Nginx or whatever. And I think that'll probably be the default. the creators of W3 Total Cache are working on an update, which will probably write .htaccess files into these directories and block access.
Oh, okay.
But you definitely want to make sure that the DB cache and object cache directories under wp-content/w3tc are blocked. You don't want to block the min or page cache directories because those files are accessed by the public on purpose, right? Your minification cache is going to be the shrunk down version of your CSS and your JavaScript.
You want to serve them
If
that.
you block those, then your page isn't going to look
Your
right.
site's going to look awfully ugly.
Exactly.
If it loads.
Now, in your case, because you're using opcode caches and memcache for all the database queries,
Right.
those files don't exist.
I'm not writing to a directory.
Yeah, you're not writing to a directory, so it doesn't matter that directory is accessible.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
And so you're not affected by this configuration error.
Yeah.
Although, just as a note, if you're using memcache, you have to remember that memcache by default doesn't have any authentication. So you need to protect it some other way. In our case, we have some firewall rules, some protection, and
Sharks with lasers.
They're also only on an internal IP address, so they can't be accessed from the internet.
That's a practical solution.
Yeah, but if other people, if you just install memcache by default, I think it listens on every IP address on that port.
Memcache for the world.
If somebody can connect to it, again, if they can use know that W3TC string to guess the cache key, they could pull out the results from your memcache as well.
Oh.
Or even APC. It's possible that if you're in a shared hosting environment, someone could execute this attack against you still.
Well, and I think the shared hosting environment is the likely scenario because you're probably going to be writing to your web directory because that's where your account has access to. You're probably not setting up a sophisticated memcache solution, although a shared hosting system might actually be the most ideal candidate to have some sort of memcache setup. But regardless, I mean, they seem like the biggest target for this kind of thing.
Well, because especially basically, if you're using the APC or memcache cache here, if it's a shared hosting environment, there's no separation between the users. There's just the cache keys. That's why, for example, the W3 total
if you're
cache
using
key.
their shared hosting.
Well, anybody's. Like if you're using anybody's and you have APC cache set up.
Yeah.
Other than the fact that your host name of your website is part of the key, if it wasn't, your keys would conflict with other people's because they'd end up being the same, right? 2 WordPress installs on the same server would be the same.
Right.
So that's why they put the host in that key. But that means that someone else who has access to the same server as you, if they know your site name, they could probably pull out your cache keys. So that's why I think it would be a good idea for W3 Total Cache to change that string to also include some secret value. Like one of the salts from the WordPress config file.
Yeah.
Right? Just so that every site has some unique part to the key. That would prevent this guy's tool from being able to brute force and guess the DB cache file names.
Right.
And it prevents someone else from pulling stuff out of the cache if it was shared in like APC or other opcode caches. Right? When you're using a MD5 hash as a key for something, it's usually good to have some secret value in there.
So there must be an update coming, right?
Yes,
they're going to do
there's an
something.
update coming that's going to address part of the issue. I don't know if
we don't know what their solution is going to be though, because it's not really a code fix.
Most likely, adding some code to make it write a .htaccess files of those directories and deny all access.
Yeah,
and that'd be good. And maybe even have it test access to those directories, and if it can't access them, say, hey, htaccess file isn't working. You need to make some other configuration. Because, for example, on Jupyter Broadcasting, it's running on Nginx, so it doesn't read the .htaccess files. I have to add the directives manually.
Yeah. Now,
especially in a shared hosting environment, your cache could be exposing your database information because the keys are predictable. So adding a secret value to make those keys unpredictable would probably be a good thing.
It just shows you still have to have a little bit of know-how if you're going to, even on a more simple setup. Now, one of the key elements to having caching set up besides just better user experience, and you've talked about this before in the past, is you sort of have there's an SEO component to it as well.
Partly, yes. So I wrote a PDF file for a presentation I gave last year at a affiliate summit meetup. But basically, it talks about how making your website faster will increase your search ranking and make you more money.
Right.
Google and Amazon and so on have found that, if your page takes longer to load, people are less likely to buy stuff or will buy less stuff. And Google has noticed this enough that they factor it into PageRank. So if two pages are competing for, say, the top slot on the Google results, if everything else is equal, which site load faster is how Google decides which one should come up first, because it's more likely the user will be satisfied by that result. So it's important that your website not take a really long time to load.
Yeah. And you can, the Webmaster tools over at Google will give you a report of what they see as load time.
Yep.
And it's worth doing. And Amazon says that for every 100 milliseconds they have they drop 1% sales.
Yep.
So they obviously think there's some money behind it, because for them that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. And anyway, so this is a PDF I put together, and it walks through a bunch of stuff, talks more about W3 Total Cache, and also kind of explains a little bit of the background behind a waterfall diagram showing why your page is taking so long to load.
Oh, cool. So Alan has that PDF linked in the show notes, as well as you spelled out some of the more important details about the story and what people need to look for in the show notes are noted there as well. So, all right, Alan, before we go on, I want to take a break and say holler to our sponsors of the TechSNAP program, GoDaddy.com. If you want to make an impact online, GoDaddy.com has you covered. Now, you see right there, they're having a Happy New Year's sale where you can get a .com for $12.99. That's a great deal. Kids, let me tell you, back in my day, I'd have been so happy for that deal. In fact, a couple of years ago, if GoDaddy would have come to this program and said, we've got a great deal for you, $12.99.coms, I would have said, yes! But no. Until the end of this month, which is very soon, until December 31st, we have an amazing deal for you. Now, you know that we've had the GoDaddy guys on here for a long time, great sponsors, but I don't think we've ever had a deal this great. If you use the checkout code TECH295 when you check out, that's TECH295 when you check out, you get that .com for $2.95. Think about that. Think about how that's cheaper than an app. That's cheaper than a cup of coffee. That's cheaper than a Egg McMuffin. I mean, it really is great. If you've had something kind of kicking around in the back of your mind for a while, something you want to launch, this expires December 31st, so it's your last chance to take advantage of Tech $295 when you check out. Also, just a reminder that $4.99 SSL certs, you can get an SSL cert for $4.99 if you use the code $4.99 SSL2. $4.99 SSL2 for $4.99 SSL certs, but that expires at the end of December as well. So these are a couple of great offers. And folks, if you just visit those links in our show notes to check out what GoDaddy's offering, that right there is supporting this show. And if you use those codes, we really appreciate it, because then you're supporting our sponsor who continues to support the TechSNAP program. So thank you everyone who does that, and thank you to GoDaddy. I think they sponsored all of 2012.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That is awesome. So thank you to GoDaddy for a great 2012, and thank you everybody who supports the program by visiting the wonderful GoDaddy.com, longtime sponsors of the TechSNAP program, because they know how much of a pain in the ass is when guys like me have clients and I walk into a business and they've used some off-the-wall domain name registrar that they don't remember the login to because Sue registered it and she doesn't work here anymore. Now they don't have the contact info, so we have to print out something on an official business letterhead and fax it over to the company. Let me tell you how thankful I am when I walk in and they say, we have all of our stuff, all of our account, all our DNS stuff is over at GoDaddy.com, because I know I'm going to be able to get the job done. So I personally use GoDaddy in my day job, and I am appreciative of their longtime sponsorship. Now, Alan, that we've
I was
GoDaddy.
say it's kind of a coincidence that my SSL certificate expires in December, and I need a new one.
Well, there you go, $4.99 SSL2.
Yep.
Now, we have a story in here about the inventor of SSH warning that some improper key management makes SSH less secure than it should be.
Yeah. So I wanted to cover the story because the regular media was doing such a bad job of it. They were making it sound like SSH was insecure and we should be using something else or something.
That does make for a fun headline.
And that's entirely not the case. And, it even says that in the story if you read it all. But
I love that one. I love when the headline is just totally mismatches the content of the article.
But in a bunch of places, the article talks about how SSH is encrypting the computer. And it's like, no, that's not what SSH does. But anyway, it's because it's creating a significant amount of FUD. I wanted to cover some
Do
of
a
the
little
information.
FUD busting here on TechSNAP. I like it. All right.
So to start, SSH is not vulnerable or compromised in any way at the moment that we know of. This isn't some new vulnerability in SSH that's going to lead to thousands of servers being hacked or anything.
All right. Okay.
So the story started with an interview with Tatu Yolonen, who's the guy that invented SSH in like 95 or whenever it was.
Okay.
And what sparked most of this was a quote. He said, in the worst case scenario, most of the data on the servers of every company in the developed world gets wiped out.
That is definitely a worst case scenario. You cannot question that.
And going on and about this, but the problem is actually caused by users and bad management practices, not by SSH.
Oh, well, surprise.
The first thing is that users often generate a lot of SSH keys rather than having, one or two canonical keys that, this is my key and I don't have any other keys.
Right.
A lot of people end up with a different key for everything. They just, they constantly generating new keys every time they get a new machine or whatever, instead of having, a specific key for things and maybe regenerating that key on a regular basis and stop using the old one and properly destroying it and so on. And the other thing is that people often store those keys unencryptable in a predictable location. Right? The default is to put it in .ssh/id_RSA, right?
Right.
And that's so that the clients will find it automatically and use it.
Yeah.
But it also means that if someone compromises your account or the server, they know exactly where to go to get all the keys.
Very true.
Right? And steal the keys.
Very true.
And that's why it's important to, put a password on those keys. Although putting a password on the key means that you can't use it for
scripts,
passwordless login and scripts specifically. So, think of that. And so the proper way to solve that problem is basically by, on a regular basis, like, if you're going to say, if you have a policy to change your password every 90 days, you should probably change your SSH key as well.
Oh, yeah.
That way, if your SSH key was compromised and you don't know it, if you're revoking access from the old key, then whoever would have had access won't this way. Also, many logins, especially those that are shared, when you have a bunch of different people that accesses the same user, which we generally don't recommend, but happens
all the time.
We'll have really large authorized keys files, right, with a huge list of keys. Especially places that allow login directly as root with an SSH key. You end up with everybody who should have root has a line in this authorized keys file.
Right.
And then, so-and-so has a laptop and doesn't have his main key on his laptop. He has a laptop key. And so he needs a second line in this file or whatever. And you end up with a bunch of different ones.
God, you're right.
And then when you're going back and looking at this file, a lot of times the comments are meaningless at the end of the file.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's just like, I don't know whose key that is. Should that key be in there or not?
Right.
And it ends up with this mess, and you don't want to take away someone's access, so you don't remove old keys from that file, and then eventually some old key is compromised, and now someone has root access on your server. Right? So it comes down to management practices of keeping track of whose keys is whose, and when they should be in there, and when they should be removed, and keeping track of all these files, and pruning out stuff that shouldn't be in there.
Mm-hmm. Which nobody ever does.
Yeah. So, for example, the SSH.com guys were auditing a large financial institution, which uses the commercial version of SSH rather than like OpenSSH, but it's the same thing.
Yeah.
They found more than 1 million unaccounted for keys.
A million, Alan?
Apparently, this bank had 10 or 100,000 servers, so that's only 10 keys per server, but still.
Okay.
That's a lot of keys. That's like an unmanageable number of keys. That doesn't make any sense. I don't know what they were doing. But and 10% of those keys granted root access. So apparently there was 100,000 different keys that gave you root access on one or more servers.
What could go wrong with that?
Yeah, or some other. Even if it wasn't root, it was some level of access on the server that let you do more than you should. And if you have 1 million keys, the chance of one of them getting out there to someone that shouldn't have it is pretty damn high.
Yeah.
And if there's a 10% chance that that key will give them root on something, that's really, really bad.
Yeah.
So the U.S. federal government has rules for classified computer networks that cover the issuance and assignments and storage of keys, but they don't really dictate what should be done with old keys and how you should actually manage unauthorized keys file and so on. Auditing guidelines require that the administrators be able to specifically list everyone who will have access to a specific system, but they're not checking the authorized keys files to actually say in the report who has access. They're just saying, oh, well, these people are supposed to have access to the server. They're not actually checking to make sure that no one other than those people actually has access.
Of course.
Because if you're just looking at an authorized keys file, it's hard to tell whose keys those are.
Oh, yeah.
Because on top of everything else, there's no cryptographic signing or anything. So I can add my key to a list of authorized keys and then in the comment put the name of some person whose key it's supposed to be.
Of course. And I would have no way to know that's false.
So I could log into Chris's NAS, add an extra key, and in the comments put, Chris's upstairs computer or whatever.
Yeah.
And Chris probably wouldn't delete that key, thinking that it was something he added at some
Better
point.
do that. I want my rsync to work.
Yeah. And meanwhile, that's giving me access to all his files. So I can go in there and delete them.
Son of a gun. Or watch them, because I got a lot of good stuff on there.
Yeah. So it's hard to tell from an authorized keys file whose key that is, if it actually is that person's key, and does that person still control that key, or should that key have been expired by now? Right? So it seems somebody should write up some set of guidelines for how you should do this. And, the comment should include a date when this key expires and someone's name or whatever. And so that we can start pruning keys authoritatively. We know for a fact that key shouldn't be there anymore.
Honestly,
it'd be
nice if, I don't know how you would do it, but it'd be nice if there's some sort of auditing facility built into SSH or something. I don't know how it would do it, though.
I don't know. I don't think I would trust any facility that automatically removes my access over SSH, though.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's for sure.
At the same time. Because, a clock gets skewed one time or something, and all of a sudden it's the future.
Or think about that. People would skew the clock on purpose.
Just to revoke my access.
That's a tough thing.
And to underscore how important this is, if we think back a couple of weeks to the FreeBSD package building cluster being compromised.
Right.
That happened because somebody gained access to someone's private SSH key.
Right.
And then once they got access to that, they logged in as some user on the build cluster. Because it was in an authorized keys file, they were allowed in, and they were able to play around on that build server when they shouldn't have been. And so it just shows that, the biggest thing with this is keeping control of your private key and managing that list of public keys of who's allowed to log in.
Mm-hmm.
And, removing keys when if you're going to stop using a key, you need to remove it in case, somehow that key gets compromised or factored or whatever. You don't want someone to be able to log in with it. So the recommendation here is that companies refresh keys on a regular basis, just like you do passwords, right? Say every 90 days or even just once a year will help. Replace all your SSH keys with new ones and disavow all the old ones.
Right.
Don't allow them to access anything anymore.
I thought of a system. People could just set themselves a cron job to send themselves an email to remind themselves.
Specifically, if you're setting up a scripted rsync or something, if you set that up, it's 5 years later, you're going to be that's still using the same key. If someone ever got access to that key, it's just rotate the key once a year.
I literally have gone in, and I won't give any details, but you go in there and I've seen scripts that are 5 years old using the same key.
I've seen, and especially worrying thing is that eventually that key is not going to be strong enough anymore.
Well, that's true too, isn't it?
You got some of these keys that are 512 bits. You can factor that now in a couple of days on an Amazon cluster.
Right, you grab that, you take it offline, and have a good time.
Yeah, and so it's important to be rotating these keys. And, if people did that, then the Debian weak keys would be gone by now. But there's still a couple of them out there because people generated a key and haven't rotated it.
Yeah.
another possible solution to help with this problem is a feature that Red Hat introduced and has been imported into the base version of OpenSSH, so it'll be available for everyone, is in addition to an authorized keys file, they're adding an authorized keys command. So you set this up in your sshd_config, and when you attempt to log in, SSHD will run a specific command as a specific user that you specify in the config, with the argument being your username. And then what it gets back is 0 or more lines of allowed SSH keys. So basically, it allows you to construct a tool to do dynamic authorized keys files.
Oh.
And I have a link here to an example of a guy that set one up for LDAP.
I was just going to go there.
So you add a property in your LDAP that allows, that stores your SSH public key for each user.
Right.
And then that allows you to basically have single sign-on for all the servers.
This is much more scalable to me. When you're talking, 20, 30 servers, it's not so bad to have to manage these key files. But when you're talking hundreds of servers...
There's tools like Puppet that you can use to manage authorized keys files.
Yeah.
Most times they're set up to append new keys to the file and keep any existing ones.
So in this example, is he
It'll
pointing
be harder to actually remove one from there with Puppet. But yeah,
he's using Active Directory, isn't he? Not
yes,
LDAP, but
I think one of the examples here actually talks to Active Directory.
That's so cool.
Because they're using Samba to have single sign-on on the consoles and stuff. But over SSH, this way, you put your public key in your LDAP or Active Directory as a property, and now that user, if they exist on that server, can log in with that key. And it makes it much easier to say, this is the one canonical key that works for that user. And when it's time to change that user's key, you change it in the Active Directory or LDAP or whatever, and now the old key won't let them in, as long as it's not. By default, OpenSSH will fall back to trying the authorized keys file if none of the keys from the authorized keys command work. So you can basically have both. You can have, a single key that works on all your servers and then fall back to a specific key for certain servers or something.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that seems... I would love to see that. I would love to see that made a little more user approachable. I don't know.
And well, right now it's the guys that built it in OpenSSH just said it's a command with one parameter being the username, and it returns 0 or more lines. It's up to you to build the tools to do whatever you want to do. And this is just one example of a Perl script. And actually, I think if you read the comments, that Perl script is vulnerable to an LDAP injection and needs some work before it goes to production. But you could also, you could make this work with an SQL directory of users or whatever you needed it to do.
You could, couldn't you? Yeah. Yeah, so if I go back to my favorites. One of my favorite setups was this client where we had our Samba logins, our internet logins. Everything was powered by LDAP, and it was so awesome. One email user account. It was everything. Sort of close to the promise of Active Directory, only implemented using all open source technologies. Yep. And I would love to have been able to at the time incorporate SSH keys with that.
Right, because you have the single sign-on with the password, but you still want to use your key.
Yeah, it's very neat. Well, so all right. So so what do we take away? So it's not SSH that's completely vulnerable and destroyed and ruined.
It's just bad administrator practices.
Right. Well, surprise there.
Specifically, you get this giant authorized keys file, and you're like, well, I don't want to remove the. I'm not 100% sure that old key isn't used somewhere, so I don't want to remove it. And so you end up with this cruft that's there forever.
Yeah.
So it'd be really nice if we did something like, like GPG keys can be set to expire at a certain date.
Yeah.
And now I'm not saying we want to change the way SSH keys work and have, not backwards compatible SSH keys or something, but just maybe a solution where in the comment you include an expiration date. And then, when you're cleaning up your authorized keys file, you're like, oh, that one's expired. Get rid of it, right? And clean it up and only use...
Just make sure that you can't set it in the past. So that way somebody doesn't log into your box and go in there and add, so everything just expires all of a sudden. Like, that'd be a good little prank, is make sure that I go and take Alan's account and say it expired on December 1st, 2012, and there we go. But I do agree with you, Alan. You need some. I have banged my head against this. Actually, I just going through and sitting down with a client saying, okay, which of these keys can we get rid of, and this is a process I actually just got done going through, cleaning it up. And then kind of sitting back and finding out what scripts broke because nothing's documented, and then going through and changing that script so it runs as the appropriate user and logs in appropriately. And all. It is such a mess if you don't stay on top of it. It's the only way to really manage is to stay on top of it, but it's just one of those things that it's out of sight, it's out of mind, it slips through the cracks, you don't think about it.
Right. And, if you got 20 authorized keys for your root login and one of those gets compromised, even if you know it got compromised, it's like, well, which one is it in this file that got compromised that I need to remove to disallow that key access as root?
Yeah.
And but basically what they're saying is that, especially in government and stuff and places with contractors coming in all the time and stuff, you end up with this huge file full of contractors that shouldn't have access anymore. And eventually, if you're talking about secured systems containing sensitive data, that's not how it should be. It needs some better system.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because we think of SSH as such a secure thing, but this is such a...
It is, but, this comes down to configuration error.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
It's not a problem with SSH. It's a problem with the way you manage your authorized keys file.
Yes, sure. All right, Alan, any other thoughts on that one?
No, not really.
All right, well then before we jump on, I just want to remind folks that you can help support the TechSNAP program and the other shows on the Jupiter Broadcasting Network. Keep us coming to you by taking advantage of our affiliate links at the bottom of Jupiter Broadcasting. We have links down there for Amazon and eBay and Netflix and Newegg and ThinkGeek and Best Buy, probably some favorites around here. Over at audible.com, there's some great books that I'll probably recommend in the future. I'm not sure if you are in the TechSNAP audience and you're a fan of Audible, let me know. I'd love to start making some more book recommendations, but I just don't know if you guys listen. I'm such an Audible fanatic that I just want to talk about it. I'll try to remember to link to this in the show notes. If you didn't know, every year Amazon does year-end deals where they have different categories. They start at 70% and it goes all the way down to 40% off different, I guess maybe it's stuff they had from the holiday shopping. They want to get rid of it and clear out inventories. But I honestly, I bought a TV doing this one year. It was like $400 off. It's a really great deal.
Nice. And
we'll link to that with the affiliated link. So if you want to go take advantage of some of Amazon's year-end deals, just check out the link in the TechSNAP show notes. It's the only place we'll have that link, but you can take advantage of that. But any of those, or grab our browser extensions, and then it'll automatically take your shopping session whenever you're at one of our affiliate sites. And we have more sites in that extension than we actually have listed on the page. And that extension's up on GitHub, so you can always go check that out too. We had I can't remember the guy's name I heard from, but somebody forked it for their church. And so their church is using it to generate revenue for the church, which is really cool. So you can check that out. We have that up on GitHub. But thank you, everybody who supports the shows by using those links or by locking in some direct funding and go and donating. You can do that over at jupiterbroadcasting.com/donate with one-time amounts or monthly amounts, which is much appreciated. All right, Alan, with all that stuff done, I believe it's time for the TechSNAP feedback. Thanks for sending your emails to TechSNAP at jupiterbroadcasting.com or popping that contact link at the top of our website. And we've got a few emails to go through this week. Alan, a little light for the holiday week, but we still got a couple of good ones. Our first one this week comes in from Project Morris, who's in the chat room right now. And he said, hey guys, this one might be a good one for tonight's show. The Raspberry Pi is used to replace a 30-foot GSM base station and create a working mobile network. And he links us to a story being run by TechCrunch, where they talk about over at Cambridge, a consulting firm over there has managed to use the open source Raspberry Pi computer to replicate the functions normally performed by a 30-foot GSM cellular base station to create a fully functional mobile network running on a Raspberry Pi. Yeah,
so you're replacing all this big telco machinery with this tiny little Raspberry Pi. I'd be slightly concerned about the networking. The fact that the Ethernet port on Raspberry Pi is backed by USB, it just seems like...
limiting. But maybe for small scale.
Yeah, well, obviously, if you were going to do this, you would probably just build something like a Raspberry Pi, but with a dedicated Ethernet port, something more like an Ethernet or something.
Right.
But yeah, it's especially for like developing countries which have bad GSM coverage or something, or just need more coverage. Being able to build this network out of a few $100s of off-the-shelf parts instead of having to buy something from a company that makes GSM base stations and charges a lot of money for them.
Right.
Also, I'm guessing the power utilization is significantly less.
Yeah, you could probably run them from battery in a lot of cases.
That depends.
Depends on probably how much broadcasting you have to do in the antenna and stuff like that. Yeah.
You're talking about a significant number of watts to be able to push out cell phone calls.
You're probably right, though. It probably does take significantly less power. So, in areas where...
Well, I guess most of the power probably comes from... or is going through the antenna, not necessarily
I would think so.
The hardware there. But yeah, a Raspberry Pi is probably going to use a lot less power than a computer that would have been there.
All right, now, on the flip side, now we're going to talk about big iron and using a lot of power. Our next email comes in from Chris, and he's got a question about bare metal hypervisors. Hey, guys, I've been enjoying TechSNAP as well as other JB offerings and wanted to thank you. I also have an idea that you guys might like to cover. With the recent coverage of Proxmox, I started to wonder the pros and cons of different bare metal hypervisors available, and he thought a hypervisor showdown might be fantastic. Well, stay tuned. It could be one episode with an overview of pros and cons, or, and I like this idea more, it could span multiple episodes and dig deep in cover topics such as storage, internal attached network, management interfaces, look and feel, operating system support, how well it handles the guest OS, networking, ease of create and modify virtual and physical configurations. Something in particular that I'm interested in is creating mirrored interfaces in the virtual network for sniffing with NIDs without having to impact the physical network. Let me know what you think. And P.S. Thank you, Chris, for the dramatic reading of users' feedback. I like that he calls himself a user. We're just such sysadmins and tech guys that you're an audience member, but I think sometimes I say users too. Now this, I don't know. Helen and I kind of work in a way where we come to the show with our practical, real-world experience of stuff that we've been using for years. So when we talk about something, we kind of have like this catalog of experience behind it, we can sort of talk about a certain amount of confidence. And Alan, I don't know what you use for hypervisors. I certainly have a few in the past, but do you use more jails than you'd say actual virtualization?
Right. At Scale Engine, we have a policy where we prefer real hardware. We run FreeBSD on the bare metal and don't hypervise, like we don't virtualize anything if we can avoid it, just because of the performance impacts. Really, to answer this question, I'd need to set aside a month and just like use all of these hypervisors.
Yeah.
And well, that's something I was at one point considering doing in order to build the next Scale Engine product, which would be something that competes with Amazon's EC2. We're now kind of looking in a slightly different direction with Beehive, which is a FreeBSD hypervisor.
Now, this is new, right? Or kind of new?
Yeah, it's new, and it's not a bare metal hypervisor, right? It's like a type 2 that sits on top of a base OS.
Okay.
Although, if you were building a FreeBSD box with the base OS, you could have it stripped down to the point where it's almost where it would be the same as a bare metal.
Well, and all these bare metal,
almost all the bare metal ones are running out of stripped down Linux. So
exactly.
It would be the closest thing to a bare metal.
Yeah.
And it's coming along quite well, although at the moment it doesn't have support for like legacy anything. So it doesn't actually emulate a BIOS, so it can't boot anything except for FreeBSD on FreeBSD. But in the future, it'll be able to run Windows and Linux and stuff. And it's really amazing how efficient it is as far as like CPU and memory access, because it's using the extended page tables and for hardware virtualization of the memory and the regular hardware virtualization for the CPU. So
that's sort of
we're looking at that as our solution now, instead of what we were considering before was Zen Server, because the licensing was a little more agreeable than VMware. In order to base our product on top of that. Whereas if you're just using it, the license doesn't matter quite as much.
Well, I think the other thing that's interesting about your decision there is, and see, this is where Chris's question sort of, I think, misses the tune with me a little bit, is I've never walked into a situation and been like, well, actually, that's not true, but I've never been like, oh, I'm just going to build any virtualization infrastructure I want using any product I want. I've always picked the virtualization product based on the problem I'm trying to solve, or the project that demands a certain type of technology. Like my current clients, pretty much always it's VMware ESX across the board. They already know about it. They already want to buy that. In some situations, it's actually been VirtualBox open source edition running on a server, and not my favorite. It's always depended on what I'm trying to do. Now, Alan, in your case, you guys are a FreeBSD shop. You have extensive experience with FreeBSD.
we've done a little bit with VirtualBox because we can run the open source version on top of FreeBSD. But yeah, the management stuff there, it's like we need some tools, and it doesn't seem like anybody's ever going to get around to writing those tools.
I mean, if you came to me and said, Chris, what is your, top tier ideals, it would be VMware ESX, it would be KVM. I've been pretty happy with KVM, and I've been really impressed by the performance. And then it would probably, if you're gonna go out from there, it'd probably be some of the solutions like Proxmox and things like that. I like Proxmox a lot. It runs on top of Debian. It has a commercial support offering. It has a very good front-end interface. It has built-in support for mirroring VMs between machines and doing migrations that otherwise would be a real pain in the ass. So Proxmox is a great solution too. But I go back to if you came to me and you said, Chris, I'm a Windows Server guy through and through. I know Active Directory. I get group policy. I get MMCs. I get the layout, how everything works. Then I would say you should use Hypervisor on Server 2012.
Yeah, Hyper-V might be the better solution if you're. Yeah, so you kind of got to look at where you are. Zen Server is pretty good, and that's what Amazon solution's based on. And
Yep.
Depending what you're doing, the reason we looked at Zen Server originally was we were looking at using OpenStack, although we're now looking more towards CloudStack because OpenStack requires a Ubuntu machine.
Womp womp.
Well, we originally avoided CloudStack because it was written in Java, and so I was like, it's big and ugly. So which trade-off is worse there? But anyway,
I like Ubuntu Server.
They had better support for Zen than VMware at that time, although VMware's joined the OpenStack consortium or whatever.
We'll see where that goes.
It comes down to you're in a really unique position if you get to pick from whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly.
Most times there's already some of something there, and it makes sense to just stick with it because it's what you're already dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But it can come down to licensing and support and what your needs are.
And I would not trust, I would not really trust anyone that came on the internet and posted some video comparing all the hypervisors, because you never really know the ins and outs of how these things work until you've ran one in a production environment for a while.
For a long time,
You've had to deal with some sort of disaster. You've had to deal with upgrades. You've had to deal with licensing problems until you've gone through all that stuff. And the only way to do it is years and years, really, often. You just can't really trust these comparisons. And the other problem with a lot of the times is, we could sit down and do the comparison, but in 6 months, it would essentially probably be invalidated by updates in all of these products. So it's a difficult thing to watch. You just kind of have to watch the technology. And then I always stress this, go with what you know the best, because that's where you're going to have the best implementation. And just like we talked with the SSH Key story, is you can have a fantastic product, but if you misconfigure it, something that's designed to be secure can be insecure. Just like with virtualization, something that's designed to help you scale, something that's help you save money. If you implement it wrong, you can create performance bottlenecks. You can create so many more headaches for yourself. It's just better to go with what you know.
Or you could end up blowing all the money you're trying to save on licensing.
Oh man, no kidding. All right, well this kind of fits in with that question. It comes from Frank, and he says, I love the show. I've created a VDI, which is virtual desktop infrastructure, that used Microsoft Server 2012 and Hyper-V. Since my graduation, I've been experimenting with Zen and have been quite impressed by OpenSUSE. Anyway, my point is that I'm looking for an open source virtual desktop broker. I've searched the web and I've not found anything that suits my needs. Are there any solutions that I'm missing? I would start with submitting.
What is a virtual desktop broker?
He's using the wrong vernacular probably in his search. So a virtual desktop broker is a Microsoft generally specific term where you have a front end that connects back to a virtual instance, and it's sort of like some Microsoft secret sauce where you get like this really great connection to a virtual machine. Sort of like, in VMware, you can go to the console mode and all of...
Right, like in VMware server, you pop up this client and you can go like full screen, and it's almost as if, when you're running VirtualBox on your computer and the computer's in a window, when you're doing it with VMware server when you're on the client machine, you're seeing it in this window, even though it's actually running on a server down the hall or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And I think even, and I might be wrong because I haven't used it myself, is... I think there is a decent, almost RDP, you can even do, Arrow accelerated desktops through it and stuff like that. You can actually get, some pretty good basic 3D DirectX rendering in these. So they're nice. They're nice. Now,
VirtualBox has VNC in the free version and RDP in the pay version.
Yeah. What he
closer.
what he needs is he needs some tools to manage these, and this is sometimes an area, like things like Proxmox and VirtualBox and VMware and Zen Commercial. They all come with really nice front end management suites, but there's some really great open source ones available. You just need to change the vernacular in what you're looking for. And if you're using OpenSUSE, these are actually all available in YAST. You just need to dig around in YAST a little bit. But libvirt is this framework that the Fedora/Red Hat guys wrote that interfaces with KVM and Zen, and then there are front-end tools that communicate via libvirt to the virtualization backend. And
right, that's actually OpenStack is based on libvirt. It's all about using libvirt to abstract the virtualizer from the admin interface, so that you're doing this command, and then doesn't matter which virtualizer you're using, it's happening in the virtualizer.
Right. And so generally any distro that you install, KVM or Zen, will actually load something for you. But if for some reason that's not happening, I'll link in the show notes. The KVM, linux-kvm.org wiki has a whole list of front-end clients that will interface with libvirt, including WebVirt Manager, which will give you a web-based libvirt interface. CloudStack's listed on here. Mm-hmm. They got a whole bunch on here. You could check it out. Proxmox, which we just talked about, actually uses it too to interface with it. So I'll put a link to that, Frank, in the show notes for you right by your question. And hopefully that'll get you started. So, I know this can be one of the challenges. The different products, like Hyper-V in this case, or Zen, they kind of have their own vernacular in some cases, and that throws you off when you're transitioning to a different system. You get the idea of what you want to accomplish, and it's possible, but there's just a little vernacular difference. And I think that's
with like a virtual desktop broker, that's not the way open source would term that feature.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a Microsoft term, and so when you're searching for it, you don't find anything except for Hyper-V, and it's just because that concept has a different name in the different ecosystems.
Now, C in the chat room is saying OVIRT, O-V-I-R-T, is the answer. KVM plus VDI plus Spice. And Spice is the protocol used for some open source virtualization management. Mm-hmm. He says it's not working great in some of the initial versions, but it might be something to check out. So there you go. OVIRT, O-V-I-R-T, plus KVM plus VDI. Now, there you go. There's a lot of different ways you can roll your own.
Yep.
So good luck, Frank, and let us know how it goes. Now, Alan, I don't know if we have an answer for this one, but Ryan writes in. He says, in one episode of TechSNAP, you and Alan talked about which providers you use for VPSs. Do you recall which episode that was, or which VPS providers you recommend? What do you think, Alan? Do you have a VPS?
I didn't recommend any because I don't use any.
I've experimented with a couple of different ones, and I of course, obviously GoDaddy is a sponsor, but for me it comes down to I want something that's super fast and easy to deploy. That's sort of the big benefit of a VPS for me, is it can be 2 a.m. and I'm working on a project and I need to set up a Linux box or a Windows box right now. That's what I love about these management panels. I don't have to wait on stuff like that. And so GoDaddy provides CentOS, Fedora, and Windows VPSs. There's also Linode, which will provide a couple of different ones. My go-to would be GoDaddy because they're an established name. They have a good, easy-to-use self-starting control panel. I don't know, chat room, if you guys have any suggestions, I'd throw them out there. But Alan, maybe another suggestion might be contact Alan at Scale Engine, and he'll set up a VirtualBox instance for you. Do you offer that kind of stuff?
It's something we were working on, but we don't really have something per se at the moment. Mostly because we don't have the control panel side of it to let you manage it, and so yeah.
Oh yeah, there's that, right?
It is something that we're working on.
Yeah. All right. Well, there you go. All right. Now one more. Oh, go ahead.
RootBSD is one of the VPS providers that will provide FreeBSD-based VPS.
Oh, cool. There you go. I hadn't even thought of a BSD-based VPS. That's awesome. All right. Well, we've got one last bit of feedback.
Basically, if you were considering Amazon, it's only good if you only need it for a certain amount of time, like a little bit at a time.
Yeah.
If you're going to run it 24/7, then Amazon will be much more expensive than you can rent an entire physical server for less money than most of the time you can get at Amazon.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that.
But if you need like 3 of them for 6 hours, then Amazon's a good solution.
Yeah. No kidding. All right, Alan. Well, if you ever do Scale Engine VPSs, we should do like a TechSNAP discount code. I bet you would have a lot of people sign up. All right. Well, our last feedback is actually a submission for the Hall of Shame. Two in a row here. We have a Hall of Shame. Now, I'm gonna get this wrong, but this is submitted by Altman5, Calero, I think maybe, It's a Latin American ISP who's installing routers with passphrases based on their BSSID and also shown in the wireless network's name. So did you grok all that? The passphrase for the router is actually displayed in the wireless network's name. It's from it's a Comtrend ADSL router. They're configured by default with 128-bit WEP encryption, and the default passphrase is taken from the MAC address, characters 3 through 12, and the MAC characters 7 through 12. The last character is reduced by 1. Also included and also they're then displayed in the wireless LAN's name. If you call them asking for the router's admin password to say change the encryption, passphrase, or maybe the SSID, they refuse to provide it. The router passwords are also stored in plain text, and he provides image proof of that. This, my friends, is a TechSNAP Hall of Shame submission for the Claro Latin American ISP. Shame on you! Now there you go.
Although it's probably the router vendor, less the ISP, but
yeah, I
both
agree.
of them are at fault.
The damning part is when he calls their tech support and they tell him to go F off and that he can't change it.
Yeah.
I don't like that
whereas
at all.
see, on my router, there's a sticker with the randomly generated password that has nothing to do with the MAC address.
Right. So they
But yeah, this reminds me of, remember those company that starts with an R, they got bought by the defense contractor that made the device, and when you connected to it, RuggedCom.
Yes.
When you connected to it, the SSH, the Telnet banner that popped up told you its MAC address.
Yeah.
And then the admin password was take the MAC address and run it through a Perl script.
Yeah.
And it was just some basic math on the MAC address, and it would give you the factory password for it. It was shameful.
For you audio listeners, I am wagging my finger right now. Wagging my finger. So now the rules to get something to the Hall of Shame is it needs to be something that if we bring public attention to, maybe in some small chance we'll alter their behavior and bring attention to it so that way others do not make the same mistake. And you can submit something to Hall of Shame by going to the techsnap.reddit.com or links.techsnap.tv, our subreddit, submitting it and tagging it Hall of Shame, and then if it gets at least 5 votes, which means it must survive any downvoting, and it must get at least 5 votes up to be considered a Hall of Shame contender. And then we'll add it to our permanent list, which is featured on the right-hand side of the TechSNAP subreddit right there, along with 7 others right now.
Yep.
Slowly building it up. One day it'll be fun maybe to reflect on like a clip show. Like if we ever had to do a TechSNAP clip show, all of the Hall of Shame submissions, that might be kind of fun. All right, Alan. Well, that's all the feedback. At least unless I didn't see it, which is entirely possible in my inbox monster. So we need your emails, any of your sysadmin questions, topic suggestions, anything you're stuck on or something you want people to know, email us, techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com, or hit that contact link and choose TechSNAP from the drop-down menu. Or, even better, start a thread in our subreddit over at links.techsnap.tv, and we'll try to feature your question or suggestion or comment in a future episode of TechSNAP. But Alan, with all the feedback done, that means it's time for the TechSNAP Roundup. And welcome to the TechSNAP Roundup. Yeah, that's what that crazy music means. Now, the Roundup are stories that didn't quite fit at the top of the show, but we still wanted to cover them, maybe give you some links to follow up on your own, and many of them are supplied by our subreddit over at links.techsnap.tv. Now, Mr. Allen, are you ready to dive into the Roundup and go through some of our stories? All right. Now, our first one is a Steam story. Steam was hit with a no connection error worldwide on Christmas.
Yes. Apparently,
That's a bummer.
they got a little joke hidden in there. They're like, they're investigating a hacker named S-Claus. They're causing a outage of Steam.
Wow.
But yes, what could be worse than getting a bunch of video games for Christmas and you activate them in Steam and all of a sudden Steam won't let you log in and play your games that you own.
Yeah.
It's
did they say what it cost
internet-based DRM and so on.
Did they say what caused the... Oh, right, because if Steam's down, you can't even authenticate the games you already have installed.
So sometimes you could switch it into offline mode and play your single-player games by yourself.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it's not fun.
Well, the only thing worse than that, Alan, would be a Netflix outage on Christmas. That would
Christmas Eve.
Right, yes.
Because everybody's sitting around and,
wanting to get their Christmas movies in,
but it wasn't really specific to Netflix. It was AWS, the Amazon Web Services, had an outage specifically of their Elastic Load Balancer. So Netflix had a bunch of these instances up ready to serve people's requests, but the Amazon load balancers wouldn't send the requests to the Netflix servers. And the Amazon outage affected a bunch of other services, including other video streaming services, but also some Roku stuff and a lot of infrastructure that is based on AWS.
I know, that is interesting, but the big story was definitely the Netflix outage, not the other guys. Yeah.
Well, and the thing was the Netflix outage was specific to certain device types. Partly because Netflix has their own physical boxes that run FreeBSD to serve a lot of their content. Not so much in the States, where they also still use other CDNs and Amazon, but especially in Europe, Netflix's network in Europe is almost exclusively served by Netflix-owned FreeBSD servers. But a lot of their infrastructure for like logging in and your passwords and like authenticating before you watch the movie is still powered by Amazon.
It looks like some folks in the chat room suffered some from this outage. Not Bryant, since he was watching vids late Christmas night on Christmas. It was definitely very stressed. Also, Dropbox downloads quit working. I didn't experience that, but I wasn't using it at the time, according to Rawzone in the chat room. So, it's one of those things where you base your business on someone else's platform. And if they have an outage, it's kind of the cost of running your business on their system.
Yep. And, it shows that the cloud is not immune to downtime.
Right. Although I believe Amazon's videos were still working at the time. Because they don't use they will only use whatever went down.
Yeah.
All right. So the next story in the roundup, Mr. Allen, is one that I don't know if we've mentioned, and is probably worthy of a mention in last two, but we talk about ZFS so much on this show, and we talk about how really it's primarily, whenever we're talking to ZFS, we're usually talking on FreeBSD. However, in our subreddit, it was linked this really, really fantastic series that Aaron Toppins has been putting together, ZFS Administration, and it's this multi-part series, everything from getting ZFS working on Linux to then going up to the fancier features, including, a lot of the nicer options available to ZFS. So if you have been thinking about experimenting with ZFS on Linux, this multi-part guide that we have linked to in the show notes might be mandatory reading, I would say. I think he focuses on Debian or Ubuntu, but I'm not sure.
Right. The guys from Lawrence Livermore Laboratories have been working on ZFS on Linux and making quite a bit of progress.
Now, something that might be a big hit with this show is a blog that was submitted to the subreddit. And honestly, this sort of wipes out a lot of our Hall of Shame entries, but that's okay. I'd like the Hall of Shame entries to take a step up. This is Plain Text Offenders, and it is a blog, a running Tumblr blog, I think. It's a Tumblr, of just websites that use plain text encryption and are often exposed in their password reset.
No encryption, basically.
Yeah.
So when I see people in the chat room every once in a while report that they found a site, and maybe they should submit it here, and we can try to name and shame these companies into using proper password hashing and proper password resetting mechanisms.
I really feel like it is, as a customer of somebody who would use no encryption or plain text encryption, it's offensive to me.
Yep.
Because they're not protecting my online identity and privacy. And there's the fact of the matter is most people use those passwords at other websites and other services. So if your site and service has a compromise and you leak my password, you've likely just leaked my password for a bunch of other sites. Now, I don't personally do that, but I know a ton of people do. And that's why this plain text crap has got to end. It
does.
Got to come to an end. So I love this blog. You can find it over at plaintextoffenders.com. I think it's a great idea.
I've seen one site where it's a hosted application that used to manage information about your customers or whatever.
Yeah.
And when you want to reset your password, they don't email it to you. You answer the security question or whatever, and it just displays it on their website without doing the email step.
Yeah.
So that means that someone that can guess the answer to the secret question can then reset the password. Or sorry, it doesn't change the password. It just gives you the old one so you can log in. So whereas if it had changed the password by resetting it, at least the original account owner would know that, hey, why can't I log in? My account's been compromised. In this case, it just displays the password, never sends an email or anything, meaning that I can then access all the information about this guy's customers and new customers in the future. So I've not only compromised the specific guy, but all of his customers.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's bad practices like that really need to stop.
It's malpractice.
Yes.
All right, Alan. Now, this next story is being run by the Daily Dot, and I think it's interesting because we've had headlines recently about fake Twitter followers and fake App Store reviews. But something that doesn't get a lot of attention is the fact that a lot of people game the YouTube likes and video plays. It's extremely common. And the Daily Dot's running a story about YouTube stripping away 2 billion fake views from Universal and Sony. And the details are in the story. You guys can go read them if you want. I just wanted to bring attention to this because this is something I've been on YouTube for years now, and I've watched. There's sort of certain indications if you're familiar with the system when somebody's kind of inflating their view counts, and I just think it's kind of ironic that the big boys are doing it too. It's just, what's the point? Why would you do this? And I just, it's good to bust them, and
because
I want to raise awareness, I guess. I don't know.
When you're doing like viral videos or whatever, on the news they mention how many YouTube views it got, and
True.
having a big number, that's the definition of being a viral video.
And there's some systems that just rank videos based on views and the views that they get within a time period. So if you get a system of bots or whatever to crank the views up really fast in a period of time, then you get on like these trending
front
charts
page and stuff.
Yeah. I just think it's crap. That's all. All right. Now this next story is a blog of. So it's a reblog of a blog that's in Brazil. So this is sort of secondhand information, but according to this blog, Brazil is blocking port 25. It's an attempt to diminish spam. The Brazilian Internet Committee has decided to completely shut down port 25. It's an attempt to diminish Brazil's ranking on the list of countries with the highest amount of spam sent. Currently, Brazil is 5th in this ranking. The port will be completely shut down in December of this year, replaced by the port 587. I guess people
which is standard.
Yeah.
Now, blocking port 25 outbound is almost every consumer ISP does this already, right? Like I'm sure Comcast does it, and Verizon and my ISP does it, so that individual Windows computers or whatever infected with a virus cannot send spam. So if they're just doing that, then that's not really that newsworthy.
Countrywide,
if you're blocking
though.
If you're doing it except for like commercial, like where a server would be, then again, that'd be fine. But yeah, if you're blocking port 25 inbound to regular mail servers, then people that are at Gmail or whatever won't be able to send you email.
You got to figure they're not going to do it for certain services, ISPs,
right,
and things like that.
I'm guessing that. Although a lot of those probably do it over SSL now, but I know even then it's port 25, so it'll be interesting to see what develops there, and the details are a little sketchy, but it mostly sounds like it's just blocking it outbound on the consumer side, which is pretty much normal. Like,
yeah, it is.
Almost every ISP does it, although this
like in
might
the States, though,
the government forcing all ISPs to do it, which would be a step up. But, if they're a significant source of spam on the internet, then it's something that needs to happen.
Yeah, and really, I mean, I don't think either one of us advocate really running a mail server at home. I mean, I've done it, and I don't look down on anybody that does do it. But it's just, it opens up another set of vulnerabilities to your home network, and who wants that crap at home?
Yeah, and most of your email is not going to be accepted by any other email server.
Oh, there's that too. Yeah,
dynamic ranges are on blacklists for a reason.
Yeah. All right. Well, so
and your ISP most likely is blocking 25 out anyway, and even if they're not, it's against the terms of service of almost every ISP to run some kind of server at your house.
Now, this next story is speaking of Netflix.
Yep.
I thought this was kind of interesting. Congress is tweaking the video privacy law so that Netflix can get on Facebook. Now, I don't know, Alan, did you see like this big announcement that Netflix made like a year ago about their planned Facebook integration?
Not specifically, but I take it that there was some...
There's
law the U.S. had about not disclosing people's video rental history or something.
Yeah, it goes back to like the VHS days, and so they've made some tweaks to it, and the end result looks kind of... I think you guys actually might already have this in Canada, but the end result is like you're going to be able to do like group viewing sessions over Facebook, I think, and like plan, send an announcement, hey, I'm going to watch this video at this time, click here, let's watch together, and like it sets up like a little chat room and all that. And so that's really what's pushing this for. And I just thought, since we were talking about Netflix, it'd be kind of interesting to bring it up. Now, this actually...
I've done that manually with Netflix with a couple of people.
Oh, yeah? Well, there you go.
Watch a movie together to talk about it or whatever.
And I've done it in the chat room. I've been in the IRC chat room and be like, all right, guys, let's watch this. And, you just do it on your own. But this is, for average users. And you're probably going to start seeing buttons on the Watch Now pages to watch on Facebook or whatever, and it's going to probably sell a lot more Facebook or Netflix subscriptions. But it's not law yet, but I thought it was something pretty interesting. It's being pushed by Patrick Leahy, a Democrat from Vermont, and you can read more. We'll have a link to the Ars Technica article if you would like.
Yep.
All right, Alan. Now, this next thread I found when I was doing a little show research this morning over on the Pwned subreddit.
Mm-hmm.
This is just totally, take it for what it is, grain of salt and everything, folks. But there is a submitter over there who is talking about how he's compromised some SCADA systems. And he has screenshots, lots of different screenshots in here of the systems that he gets access to. And he talks a lot about the details. He says it's a Siemens system, as always. And this Siemens particular system is running on Windows CE. And he says it's something that controls gas tanks and a bunch of freezers. And he's able to shut down, and this is what I thought was interesting, is he shut down what's called the LCD control, not like the LCD panel, but a type of control system, so that way other people don't screw with it. So he remotely gained access to the SCADA system and then is shutting down some of the vulnerabilities. And then they go on to talk about how there's groups of people out there that are doing this. He goes into more details. People in the thread ask him questions about what he's doing. Extremely fascinating because we talk about these sort of infrastructure systems that are vulnerable. Well, here's somebody who's actually gone out, done a series of port scans, found some that have been connected to the internet, has gotten access to them, and then according to him, has shut down some of the vulnerabilities. It was a pretty interesting read this morning. Obviously, there's no story that's been written around this or anything like that because it's just a guy who's just talking about his discovery. But the screenshots are interesting, and you guys might want to read up a little bit more on your own.
Yep.
All right, Alan, the last roundup story we have is how the internet became a closed shop. Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's just a rather long article that some people might be interested in, and it just talks about how, when the internet was a little younger and we had open standards and, it was all about making everything work together, and now we're seeing things where we're getting these walled gardens like AOL used to be with, there's Google and there's Twitter and your Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon and so on, and not being able to freely move your information back and forth between them and stuff.
Yeah, no kidding, right? And the other element that I think is worth taking a look at is how the telcos are sort of locking down on the infrastructure side. So you have duopolies that go in and they own a lot of the physical networking, and you have to pay them to get on the wire. I just talked about Audible earlier. An amazing book that I really recommend. It is just as fascinating. It makes you really think, and they compare it to previous technological revolutions like the radio and television and the telegraph and all this kind of stuff. The Master Switch, The Rise and Fall of Information Empires by Tim Wu. I'll link to the audiobook in the show notes. It's also available on Amazon. Great book. It really opened my eyes to kind of how radio and TV were considered this new medium that was going to spread information across the world and enable people to communicate in a democratic and free way that couldn't be controlled by corporations. And that's how a lot of these new technologies start. And the original people that really get passionate about it, that's how they all, like you and I, it's how we talk, that's how we think. But then slowly over time, they become more corporatized, more locked down, more about profit and things like that.
Yeah, like,
amazing book.
In the earlier days of the internet, there were literally thousands and thousands of little dial-up ISPs. Anybody could start one fairly easily, with like 100 or 1,000 customers or whatever. But now there's really only, a couple of major companies in each country, and that's it.
Yeah. I mean, I used to, my first ISP was guys I went to school with. After they they were a couple of classes ahead of me, and then after they graduated, they started an ISP, and then by the time I graduated and moved out, I signed up for their dial-up service. They ran out of my local town. They were the coolest guys ever, man. They ran game servers there locally, so you dial up and you would essentially have local access to game servers. It was a real community. Like, I knew the other people who used my ISP.
Yes.
Like, we created our own little LAN almost in a way. And it lasted for a couple of years, but then, they got replaced by like Earthlink or something like that. Yep. And so anyways, it's a fascinating story to read, and if you have a little extra time or you need a good book, The Master Switch by Tim Wu, just an amazing audiobook and an amazing book to read too. So I recommend that. Kind of puts a lot of these things in perspective. So. All right, Alan. Well, I think we just wrapped up our last episode of 2012.
Yep.
Good show, sir. Episode 90 at that, too. So, of course, now TechSNAP is live every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific, which is
4 p.m. Eastern, 2100 UTC.
And you can join us over at jblive.info, too, if you want just the audio stream, which is great for you commuters on your smartphone, or maybe if you're stuck at a desk and they don't want you streaming video. We've got 128 kilobit versions and a 64 kilobit version available over at jblive.info. All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode of TechSNAP, and we'll see you right back here next week.